Does divorce mean failure in faith, or can it be part of God's greater plan? Eve sat in the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She barely heard the judge's words as he finalized the divorce. Just like that, years of love, devotion, and sacrifice were reduced to paperwork and a gavel's cold, final sound. She had spent sleepless nights praying for a miracle, for restoration, for a sign that God would step in. But nothing changed. And now it was over. As she walked out of the courthouse, the sun was shining, mocking her pain with its warmth. She used to believe in the idea that if you did everything right, God would bless you. If you prayed enough, fought hard enough, loved deeply enough, things would work out. But divorce? That wasn't supposed to be part of her story. Eve stepped into her empty house, silence greeting her like an old enemy. The walls still held the echoes of a life that no longer existed. She ran her fingers over the indentation on the couch where her husband used to sit, over the framed wedding photo still hanging on the hallway wall. What was she supposed to do with all these remnants of a love that had died? That night, she sat on the edge of her bed, Bible in hand, flipping through pages she had once found comfort in. God hates divorce, she had been told. But did he hate her now? She searched for an answer, but the silence was deafening. Eve closed her eyes, exhaustion weighing her down. She wasn't just losing a marriage, she was losing the certainty of her faith. Sunday morning came, but the familiar comfort of church now felt foreign. Eve sat near the back, avoiding eye contact, feeling every whisper, every glance. Was she imagining it, or had the air changed since her divorce became public knowledge? After the service, Mrs. Carter, an elder of the church, approached her with a look of forced sympathy. "Eve, dear," she sighed, patting Eve's hand, "I just want you to remember, God hates divorce." The words struck like a knife, confirming her worst fears. Pastor Dillon was kinder, but still hesitant. "Marriage is sacred," he reminded her. "But God is merciful." His tone was careful, like he wasn't sure if mercy fully applied in her case. Eve nodded, but inside, she felt exposed, like a fallen believer who had let God down. The church had always been her refuge, but now, it felt like a courtroom. She left quickly, the weight of judgment pressing heavier than ever. If even the church saw her as broken, where could she possibly go from here? The drive home was a blur. Eve gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her mind replaying every word from that morning. God hates divorce. The phrase looped in her head like a cruel mantra. Was she now defined by her failure? Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. "Sarah." She hesitated before answering. "Hey, come over," Sarah said. No pleasantries, just a command wrapped in warmth. Minutes later, Eve sat across from her oldest friend, a cup of tea steaming between them. Sarah didn't waste time. "Eve, when did we start believing that broken things can't be loved?" Eve blinked. The Bible says a lot of things," Sarah interrupted gently. "It also says that Jesus met a woman at a well, 5 failed marriages, living with a man who wasn't her husband, and instead of condemning her, he offered her living water." Eve swallowed hard. She had read that story 100 times, but tonight it felt different. Sarah reached for her hand. "You're not less loved because of this divorce. You're not less worthy." Tears burned Eve's eyes. For the first time in weeks, she felt something shift, a crack in the weight she'd been carrying. "Come with me," Sarah said. "I want you to meet some women." Eve hesitated but nodded. An hour later, she walked into a cozy room filled with a dozen women, all seated in a circle. Their faces were different, their stories unique, but the moment they smiled at her, she saw it, recognition. They knew her pain. And just like that, for the first time in a long time, Eve didn't feel alone. That night, Eve lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The voices of the women from the support group echoed in her mind. Some had been abandoned. Some had left for their own survival. Some had spent years questioning if God still loved them. And yet, they still believed. She reached for her Bible again, this time flipping to John 4. The woman at the well. She read slowly, letting the words settle. Jesus didn't shame her. He didn't tell her she was beyond saving. Instead, he offered her something greater than what she had lost. Wasn't that the heart of the gospel? Eve sat up, heart pounding. She had spent weeks begging God for answers, and he had been answering all along. But if that were true, then why did the church, the very place that claimed to reflect Christ, make her feel like she no longer belonged? That question would not leave her mind, and she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Eve hesitated before stepping into the church the following Sunday. The sanctuary, once a place of comfort, now felt like a test she wasn't sure she could pass. Would the whispers still follow her? Would the silence be louder than the judgment? She took a seat near the back, eyes scanning the congregation. The usual warmth of worship filled the room, voices rising in unity. But as she looked around, she saw it, the subtle shifts in expression when people noticed her. Some smiled, tight-lipped and hesitant. Others avoided her gaze altogether. She exhaled slowly. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe she was projecting. Then the sermon began. Pastor Dillon stood at the pulpit, his voice steady as he spoke about the sanctity of marriage, about commitment, about how true love endured through trials. Eve's stomach twisted. The message wasn't directed at her, but it might as well have been. She felt the weight of every word, every unspoken assumption. When the service ended, she lingered, watching as people chatted in clusters. No one approached her. No warm hugs. No invitations to lunch like before. She thought of Sarah's words, of the women in the support group who had felt the same coldness after their divorces. This wasn't just her experience. This was a pattern, and the realization hurt more than she expected. When she finally made it outside, she found Pastor Dillon standing near the entrance, shaking hands with members as they left. He smiled at her. "Eve, how are you doing?" The question was polite, careful. She almost said fine, almost brushed it off, but something in her refused to stay silent. Honestly? She met his gaze. "I feel like I don't belong here anymore." His smile faltered. "Eve, that's not true. This is your church family." "Then why does it feel like I've been exiled?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Why is it that when I was married, I was welcomed, but now, after my divorce, I feel invisible?" Pastor Dillon opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "I'm sorry you feel that way," he said after a pause. "That's not our intention." Eve nodded, but the words felt hollow. Intention didn't erase reality. As she walked to her car, she made a decision. She wouldn't beg to fit where she was no longer welcomed. If the church had no space for women like her, then maybe she needed to find a faith that did. Eve sat in her living room, her Bible open, but for once, she wasn't searching for condemnation. She was searching for Jesus. Not the Jesus people used to shame her. Not the one whose name had been weaponized against her. The real Jesus. She flipped through the Gospels, reading with fresh eyes. There he was, touching lepers when society called them unclean. Defending the woman caught in adultery when the religious leaders wanted to stone her. Sitting with sinners, tax collectors, outcasts. He wasn't in the temple preaching judgment. He was in the streets, offering grace. And then it hit her. Maybe the church's rejection wasn't a reflection of Christ at all. Maybe he had been with her all along. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered a prayer, not of guilt, but of surrender. "God, if you still want me, if you still see me, show me where to go." The answer didn't come in a voice from heaven. It came in a text message from Sarah. "New Bible study at my place this Friday. No judgment, just Jesus. Come if you want." Eve stared at the message, her heart pounding. This wasn't the faith she had known. But it was the faith she had been searching for all along. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope. Eve hesitated outside Sarah's door, the sounds of laughter and conversation spilling into the night. It had been weeks since she'd felt part of anything, and now, standing here, she realized just how much she had missed it. She wasn't sure what to expect. Would this group be different from the church? Would she still feel like a woman marked by divorce, forever carrying the weight of her broken vows? Taking a deep breath, she knocked. Sarah opened the door with a knowing smile. "You came." Eve nodded, stepping inside. The living room was filled with familiar faces, women from the support group, a few new ones she didn't recognize. They weren't dressed in their Sunday best. There were no pews, no formalities. Just people real, imperfect, and unafraid to show it. As she sat down, the conversation continued as if she had always been there. They spoke about life, struggles, faith, the real kind, not the polished version people put on for church. They didn't shy away from the hard questions. "Sometimes I wonder, one woman admitted. "If God is disappointed in me for getting divorced." Eve stiffened at the word. Sarah shook her head. "Why do we assume God is more grieved by our divorce than by the pain that led to it?" Silence filled the room. "I used to think God only blessed people who did everything right," Eve found herself saying. "But what if he blesses the broken too?" A few women nodded. "I don't think divorce defines us," another woman added. "Jesus never turned his back on people because they had a past. He met them where they were. He meets us where we are." Eve let those words sink in. For so long, she had believed that divorce had separated her from God. But what if it had only brought her closer? What if, in the breaking, she had found the true heart of grace? She thought back to the countless nights she had prayed for her marriage to be saved, for her husband to change, for things to go back to the way they were. But maybe God's answer had never been about fixing what was already shattered. Maybe his answer had been to lead her through it, to teach her that love, his love, wasn't conditional on her ability to hold everything together. As the night wore on, Eve felt something shift inside her. Not a dramatic revelation, not an instant healing, but a quiet, steady assurance she was still his. And nothing, not divorce, not judgment, not even her own doubts, could change that. When she left Sarah's house that night, the air was cool against her skin, the sky a vast stretch of stars above her. She had no idea what the future held. She didn't have all the answers. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She was free. And that, she realized, was a beginning,